The projector in the small, airless screening room of the KGB's Special Archive whirred with a sound, like a trapped insect. Dust motes danced in its harsh beam of light. On the screen, grainy, silent black and white footage jerked to life. Major Igor Semyonov, a man whose face had been carved by years of interpreting secrets rather than showing emotion, watched, motionless. It was not a combat film. It was an administrative record. The timestamp in the corner read 12:04/1945, an airfield somewhere in Poland. The camera panned across 7 figures in parachute gear, checking equipment under the cold, pre-dawn sky. They were not looking at the camera. They were in their own world. Captain Leonid Gromov stood apart, a map held against the fuselage of a waiting Li-2 transport plane. His finger traced a route, his lips moving in silent instruction to his second-in-command, the broad-shouldered Sergeant Sokolov, who nodded, his face a mask of grim focus. Then the film jumped. A close-up. Lieutenant Vera Sokolova, the radio operator, was smiling. Not at the camera, but at the young sapper, Nikolai Petrov. She was adjusting the strap of his helmet, saying something. He grinned back, a boyish, nervous flash of teeth that transformed his entire face. For a second, the war vanished. Then Vera's smile faded as she turned, her eyes searching for Gromov, the professional mask sliding back into place. Another cut. The group was lined up now. An political officer in a pristine uniform gave a short, inaudible speech, shaking each hand. When he reached Gromov, the captain's handshake was brief, his gaze lingering somewhere past the officer's shoulder, on the horizon, where the war waited. The commissar's smile did not reach his eyes. The final shot was the most haunting. The 7 were walking towards the plane's open hatch, backs to the camera, silhouetted against the gray metal. Gromov led, then Sokolov, then Vera, then young Kolya, then the others. They did not look back. One by one, they were swallowed by the dark maw of the aircraft. The film ended with a jarring white flash, then darkness. The projectors were died. The room's single bulb flickered on, revealing Semyonov and the archivist, a frail old man with trembling hands named Pavel. The dispatch log confirmed their jump at 2317 over the designated zone. Pavel's voice was a dry rustle. The last signal from the radio operator, Lieutenant Sokolova, was received at 0105. 3 words. Zenith. Landed. Proceeding. After that, nothing. Radio silence. Semyonov said nothing. The ghost of Kolya's smile hung in the air. And the mission parameters? Semyonov's own voice sounded strangely hollow in the small room. Pavel placed a thin folder on the table. It was not the main file. It was a single flimsy carbon copy of the original battle order. Semyonov read it. Destroy the forward command post of General Venk's 12th Army. Grid coordinates. Estimated enemy strength. Approved methods. Explosives. Ambush. Any means necessary. Standard, brutal efficiency. Then his eyes caught a handwritten annotation in the margin. A different ink. Scrawled in a rushed, angular script. It was not part of the official order. It was a note from the front intelligence officer to the handler. It read, Source, Nightingale, Reliability. B. Intel on Wenk's location, unconfirmed as of 11:04. Suggest caution. Someone had drawn a single heavy line through the note, almost tearing the paper, not dismissing it, erasing it. Who was the handler? Semyonov asked, his finger on the crossed-out warning. Pavel looked down. Colonel Mikhailov, Department S, Special Tasks. He approved the mission based on the original uncorrected intelligence. He was reprimanded after the disappearance. transferred to the Far East. Died in a Jeep accident in 1948. The words hung in the air. A reprimand. A transfer. An accident. The grammar of the state was perfectly clear to Semyonov. And the source? Nightingale? Compromised. Captured by the Gestapo on April 14th. Executed. Pavel's answer came too quickly. It was a rehearsed line from a much older report. Semyonov leaned back. The pieces were not fitting together. They were forming a shape he recognized all too well. A mission launched on unconfirmed intelligence. A warning deliberately ignored. A handler professionally destroyed. A source conveniently silenced. This was not just a disappearance. This was a cleanup operation that had begun before the plane ever took off. Pavel then brought the main file, the one stamped Permanent Storage. It was thick with decades of silence. Semyonov opened it, not to the beginning, but near the end. He bypassed the old interrogations of German prisoners, the dead-end searches. He looked for the most recent entry. It was a memorandum from 6 months ago, from his own superior, General Volkov, to the Archive Directorate. The subject line, Final Disposition of Historical Irregularities, Case Zenith 7. The text was a masterpiece of opaque language, but one phrase burned itself into Semyonov's mind. To ascertain a narrative of heroic sacrifice, conclusively terminating any possibility of future speculative inquiry, thus achieving final resolution for the record and for any remaining next of kin. Ascertain a narrative, not find the truth, terminate inquiry, not seek answers, achieve final resolution, close the file permanently with a story that would bear official scrutiny. Semyonov closed the folder. He looked at Pavel, who would not meet his eyes. The old archivist knew. He had been preserving this corpse of a story for decades, waiting for someone to come and give it a proper, state-sanctioned burial. "I need everything," Semyonov said, his voice now cold and sharp, the professional armor locking back into place. The personnel files of all 7, the full debrief of the pilot who dropped them, the radio logs from that night, not just the excerpt, every document, however minor, that mentions Nightingale or Colonel Mikhailov, and the address of the last registered next of kin for Captain Gromov. Pavel nodded, a quick, bird-like motion of relief and fear. The investigation, the real one, had begun. But as Semyonov gathered the first stack of papers, his mind was not in the archive. It was in the freezing hold of that Li-2 transport plane, watching those 7 backs, walking into the dark. He was no longer just solving a disappearance. He was walking into that darkness after them, and the orders in his pocket were a leash trying to pull him back. The hook was set. He needed to know what they saw in that darkness, even if the state had already decided it was better left unseen. The darkness inside the fuselage of the Li-2 was absolute, a physical weight pressed against the eardrums, broken only by the deafening, vibrating roar of the engines. The air smelled of cold metal, fuel, sweat, and the sharp, coppery tang of fear that no amount of courage could fully erase. Captain Leonid Gromov felt the vibration through the soles of his boots, up through his bones. He did not look at his men. He felt them. A collective organism of tension coiled in the gloom. His eyes, adjusted to the faint red glow of the jump light, scanned the silhouettes. Sergeant Sokolov, a mountain of a man, methodically checking the harness of young Kolya for the 3rd time. The boy's face was a pale oval, his breathing visible in quick white puffs. Vera sat apart, her eyes closed, fingers moving silently over the dials of her RSB-3F radio set, as if in prayer. her lips forming the call signs. The others, the medic Chistyakov and the scouts Voronin and Belyaev, were statues, lost in their own private silences before the storm. Gromov's mind was not on the jump, nor on the technicalities of the mission. It was fixated on the final briefing, hours ago. The intelligence officer, a slick major from Smersh with manicured nails, had pointed at the map with a ruler. "Wenk's brain is here. You cut it out." The certainty in his voice was absolute, papal. But Gromov had seen certainty before, in 41, when commanders swore the Germans would not cross the border. That certainty had led to cauldrons, to encirclements, to mountains of dead. He had asked about contingencies, about fallback points if the intelligence was stale. The major's smile had been thin, dismissive. "The intelligence is gold, Captain. Your task is steel. Don't confuse the two." Now, suspended between earth and sky, the intelligence felt like gossamer. The mission parameters etched in his mind felt like lines drawn in water. A sudden lurch. The red light blinked on, casting hellish shadows. The jumpmaster, a grizzled sergeant with eyes that had seen too many drops, yelled against the roar. "Hook up!" The ritual began. The metallic clack, clack, clack of static lines being snapped onto the steel cable. A sound that always reminded Gromov of a hammer cocking. He moved down the line, a hand on a shoulder here, a hard, confirming look there. He stopped before Kolya. The boy's eyes were wide, searching for an anchor. Gromov didn't offer empty reassurance. He leaned in, his voice a gravelly cut through the engine's scream. "Remember the river. The landing zone is 2 kilometers east of the bend. See the bend in your mind. Everything else is noise." He was not giving a geography lesson. He was planting a fixed point in the tsunami of chaos about to hit them. Kolya nodded, a sharp, jerky movement, his fingers tightening on his packstrap. At Vera he paused longer. Her gaze was already operational, clear and cold. She gave him a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a subordinate to a commander. It was an understanding between two professionals who knew the odds better than anyone in the plane. In her eyes he saw his own silent question reflected. What are we really jumping into? The green light flashed. The world exploded into violent motion. The jumpmaster wrenched the hatch open. A furious, icy gale screamed into the cabin, tearing at clothing, stealing breath. The roar became a primal howl. Outside was not darkness, but a swirling, terrifying void, occasionally lit from below by distant, silent flashes of artillery fire, like the blinking of monstrous deep-sea creatures. "Go!" Sokolov went first, disappearing into the maw without a sound. Then Voronin, Belyaev. Chistyakov crossed himself quickly and vanished. Then it was Kolya's turn. The boy froze for a heartbeat, his body rigid against the elemental force. Gromov behind him didn't shout. He placed a firm, unyielding hand between his shoulder blades and pushed. Not a shove of anger, but a transfer of momentum, of imperative. Kolya stumbled forward and was swallowed by the night. Vera moved next. She turned at the very edge, not to look at Gromov, but to look back into the fuselage, at the empty spaces where they had sat. A final sweeping glance, as if memorizing the last place that was remotely safe. Then she stepped off, cleanly, a deliberate fall into the abyss. Gromov was alone at the hatch. The wind clawed at him. Below, his men were already scattered seeds in the wind, their destinies untethering from his. He took one last breath of the plane's foul, familiar air, and jumped. The noise ceased. For a few seconds there was a breathtaking, surreal silence, broken only by the rush of air. The plane's lights dwindled to a speck and were gone. He was alone in the universe, suspended above a landscape of shadows and distant, malevolent glows. The peace was a lie. Then the heart-stopping jolt as the canopy cracked open above him, the silk billowing with a sound like a giant's sigh. The harness bit into his thighs. Now he was a target, drifting slowly, vulnerably, towards the earth. He looked around, straining his eyes. For a moment he saw nothing but the void. Then, a darker shape against the gloom, another canopy. To the east, another. A surge of primal relief. They were not entirely scattered. The descent was an eternity of exposed helplessness. The ground invisible rushed up to meet him. The impact was a brutal personal earthquake. He hit a plowed field, the frozen furrows hammering the air from his lungs. He rolled, tangling in the lines, the rough silk collapsing around him like a shroud. Silence descended, deeper and more profound than any he had ever known. The roar was gone. Only the whisper of the wind and the frantic drumbeat of his own heart in his ears. He fought his way out of the harness, his movements swift and practiced. He crouched, PPSH-41 submachine gun materializing in his hands, eyes piercing the darkness. The landscape resolved itself. A field, a skeletal line of trees to the north, the smell of damp earth and wood smoke. A low whistle, the prearranged signal, came from the tree line. Sokolov. Another, fainter, from further east. One by one, shadows detached themselves from the gloom and converged on his position. Sokolov, massive and unharmed. Voronin and Belyaev, already scanning the perimeter. Chistyakov, checking his medical kit. Kolya, breathing hard but with a wild, exhilarated light in his eyes. He had made it. They waited. A minute stretched into 2. The wind picked up, rustling the collapsed parachutes. Gromov's eyes fixed on the direction from which Vera should have come. Nothing. A cold knot tightened in his stomach. The radio operator. Their only lifeline to the world. Lost on the first minute of the mission. Then a soft scuff from behind a low hedge. Vera emerged, her face smudged with dirt, her radio pack secure on her back. She had landed hard. A slight stiffness in her gait betrayed a possible twist. But her expression was one of fierce concentration. She gave Gromov a curt nod. Functional. They gathered the chutes, burying them in the muddy furrows. No words were exchanged. The ritual of survival had begun. Gromov consulted his compass, the luminous dial a tiny, defiant eye in the darkness. The river bend was northwest. He pointed. Sokolov took point, melting into the shadows. Voronin and Belyaev flanked. Kolya fell in behind Gromov. Vera followed, her ears seemingly tuned not to the forest sounds, but to the invisible ether, listening for ghosts on the frequency. As they moved into the deeper darkness of the German forest, Gromov cast one last glance at the sky. The transport plane was long gone. The thread connecting them to home, to the certainties of command, was severed. They were on their own now, in the belly of the dying beast. And the first unspoken question hung among them, heavier than their equipment. The radio signal had been sent, landed proceeding. But proceeding towards what? A confirmed target? Or the unconfirmed grave that a rushed hand had tried to annotate on their orders? The mission was alive. The doubt had landed with them. The forest was a cathedral of grotesque shadows and profound, listening silence. The raw, earthy smell of pine and damp rot was undercut by a sharper, more sinister scent carried on the wind, the distant, acrid tang of burning fuel and charred wood. This was not the pristine wilderness of the training grounds. This was a landscape in the terminal stages of collapse. Major Igor Semyonov's investigation in 1968 was a journey into a different kind of wilderness. He sat in a clean, sunlit office in East Berlin, across from a wiry, elderly man named Otto Fleischer. Fleischer had been a low-level clerk in the Wehrmacht's logistics office in Magdeburg in April 1945. He was a historical footnote, unearthed by Semyonov's meticulous sifting of captured personnel rolls. Fleischer's hands trembled slightly on the polished table, not from fear of the KGB major, but from the memories being unearthed. The front was not a line then. Fleischer's voice was a papery whisper, filtered through an interpreter. It was a soup, a thick soup of rumors, panic, and contradictory orders. We knew the Russians were across the Oder, but also suddenly everywhere. Reports of partisans, of saboteurs, of enemy patrols behind us would flood in. Most were hysterical. Men seeing ghosts. Semyonov placed a captured German military map from April 1945 on the table. It was annotated with frantic, handwritten corrections and arrows. We are interested in one specific ghost story. Night of April 13th to 14th. The area near the Elbe Bend, south of Rogtaetz. Any reports of parachute landings, of engagements with unidentified infiltrators? Fleischer's eyes, pale and watery, scanned the map as if it were a haunted object. He pointed a bony finger not at a military symbol, but at a cluster of handwritten notes in the margin. See here? Not from the army, from the Volkssturm commander in the village of Birkenwald. A report of gunfire and foreign voices near the old lumber mill. Dated April 15th. It was filed, stamped unverified, and ignored. We had no resources for hunting ghosts. We were trying to hold back the flood. In Semyonov's mind, the sterile archive and the dark German forest fused. The ghosts began to take shape, moving through the chaos, Fleischer described. For Captain Gromov and Zenith 7, that chaos was a physical, suffocating reality. They moved like wolves, silent, alert, senses stretched to breaking point. Sergeant Sokolov, at point, would freeze, a raised fist halting the entire world behind him. They would melt into the undergrowth as the sounds of war passed them by. The distant, throaty growl of a German half-track retreating east towards a front that was already in their rear. The desperate, mournful clatter of a horse-drawn cart piled high with the possessions of fleeing civilians. They witnessed scenes from a disintegrating world. On the second day, from a ridge, they watched a column of ragged German soldiers, their uniforms torn, their eyes hollow with a fatigue deeper than sleep. They were not marching to the front. They were walking away from it, led not by officers, but by a shared animal instinct for survival. An SS officer in a black leather coat stood by a staff car, screaming at them, waving a pistol. They shuffled past him, ignoring him as if he were a madman raving at the wind. The officer fired 2 shots into the air, then slumped against the car, his authority as meaningless as the paper it was printed on. This was the first crack in the mission's logic. The enemy they were tasked to decapitate was no longer a coherent military body. It was a dying organism, its nerves firing random, spasmodic impulses. Vera, during a brief rest halt in a dank ravine, unfolded her radio set. Her face, illuminated by the faint glow of the dials, was tense. She attempted to make contact with Center to send a coded request for confirmation of the target's coordinates. The ether hissed back at her, a storm of static, fragmented German transmissions and manic, overlapping broadcasts from Berlin radio. The orderly world of codes and scheduled transmissions had drowned in the noise of the apocalypse. She caught a phrase, a string of numbers that could have been a new coordinate, but it was swallowed by a burst of screeching interference. She looked at Gromov, her frustration and dawning alarm clear. The lifeline was not just silent. It was severed by the pandemonium of the war itself. It was young Kolya, who stumbled upon the second, more visceral truth. While scouting a path ahead, he signaled a halt. Ahead, in a small clearing, was not a military unit, but a scene of biblical horror. A makeshift camp of German refugees, women, children, ancient old men, huddled around sputtering fires. They were surrounded by the detritus of a vanished life. Suitcases, bundles, a perambulator filled with china. Their faces were blank with a shock so profound it had erased all emotion. Among them moved figures in tattered Wehrmacht uniforms, not as guards, but as fellow refugees, sharing scraps of black bread. The target area was not a sterile zone of military importance. It was a swamp of human despair. Destroying a command post here would not be a surgical strike. It would be a massacre of the already damned. Gromov ordered a wide detour. As they skirted the clearing, Kolya couldn't look away from a small girl clutching a porcelain doll, her eyes huge in a grimy face. The sight was a different kind of shrapnel, embedding itself silently in the soul of the young sapper. His war, the one of clear objectives and explosive formulas, was colliding with a war of utter, senseless ruin. Back in 1968, Semyonov found another document. It was a teletype intercept, dated April 16, 1945, from the local Gestapo office in Magdeburg to Berlin. It was fragmented, partially destroyed, but one line was legible. Following interrogation of local Volkssturm elements, possibility exists that partisan activity near Birkenwald is in fact stranded enemy airborne elements. Request authority for coordinated Jagdkommando hunt, as regular forces are unreliable. The word Jagdkommando, hunt commando, not soldiers, but hunters. Semyonov saw it clearly now. Zenith 7 had not landed in a prepared defensive zone. They had landed in a lawless, collapsing hinterland, where the official army was fleeing, and the hunt was being taken up by something else, fanatical, localized, and far more dangerous, because it had nothing left to lose. The two timelines mirrored each other in their revelation of chaos. In 1945, Gromov was realizing his mission was based on a reality that had ceased to exist. In 1968, Semyonov was piecing together how that same chaos had created a perfect trap, a target that was a phantom, an enemy that was dissolving, and a new, more vicious predator rising from the ashes to hunt the hunters. The investigation was no longer about finding 7 men. It was about reconstructing the moment they stepped off the map of conventional war and into the abyss. The old lumber mill rose from the pine forest like the fossilized skeleton of a forgotten beast. Its sawtooth roof sagged under the weight of neglect and damp. Rusted machinery, skeletal and silent, stood frozen in mid-action behind grime-caked windows. The air here was different, thicker, carrying the perpetual sweet rot scent of decaying timber and the sharp, cold tang of the nearby stream that once powered the blades. For Captain Gromov, it was not a refuge. It was a calculated risk, a place to pause, to breathe, to attempt to reestablish the severed connection to a world that still made sense. The group moved inside with the caution of predators entering a rival's den. Sergeant Sokolov cleared the main workshop, his movements a study in controlled, lethal efficiency. The vast space was a cathedral of shadows, shafts of weak afternoon light piercing the dust-moted gloom through broken roof tiles. Vera immediately sought a clear spot near a window, the logic of a radio operator seeking the best chance for a signal. She shrugged off her pack, her fingers already working the clasps of the RSB set with a familiar, desperate urgency. The others spread out, creating a defensive perimeter within the corpse of the industry. Young Kolya, his face still marked by the haunting vision of the refugee child, was posted at the main entrance, hidden in the shadow of a giant, rusted, circular saw blade. His instructions were explicit. Absolute silence. Signal at the slightest anomaly. The weight of the responsibility settled on his young shoulders, a tangible load that straightened his back and sharpened his gaze into the sun-dappled, deceptive peace of the forest outside. Inside, the silence was broken only by the static hiss from Vera's headset and the soft, tense sounds of men checking weapons, taking sips of tepid water, trying not to think too far beyond the next minute. Gromov unfolded his map, the paper crisp and alien in the organic decay of the mill. The coordinates for Wenk's supposed command post glowed in his mind, a point on the map that felt increasingly like a mirage. He traced their route from the drop zone. They were close. Too close for the utter absence of military activity they had witnessed. His soldier's instinct, honed in the crucible of Stalingrad, screamed that something was fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. Vera's sharp intake of breath cut through his thoughts. She was hunched over her set, one hand pressing the headset to her ear, the other fine-tuning a dial with microscopic precision. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with a furious, focused intensity. She had caught something in the ether, a signal, weak and fluctuating, but structured. It was not center. The cadence was wrong, the encryption pattern unfamiliar, a stuttering, repeating pulse that spoke of automation, not a human operator. A beacon, a homing signal, or a trap. She scribbled furiously on her notepad, her brow furrowed in concentration. She motioned Gromov over, pointing to the frequency numbers and the strange, repeating code fragment. Her look was unequivocal. This is not ours. This is here, and it is active. Before Gromov could process this new electronic ghost, a new sound fractured the moment. Not from the radio, but from outside. A soft, distinct crunch. The sound of a careful foot on gravel and pine needles. Every man froze. Weapons were raised without a sound. Bolts drawn back in a symphony of muted, oiled clicks. Gromov's eyes shot to the entrance where Kolya was stationed. He saw the boy's silhouette, tense, peering out. Kolya raised a hand, signaling he had heard. He leaned forward slightly, trying to pierce the green gloom of the forest edge. A minute passed. Then another. The forest had swallowed the sound, returning to its illusory calm. The tension inside the mill was a live wire, humming. Kolya, after a long, careful scan, relaxed his posture by a fraction. He began to turn his head back towards the interior, to signal an all-clear. It happened with a speed that defied perception. From the deep shadow beneath a cluster of ferns, 10 meters from the entrance, a single muzzle flash erupted. Not the long, ragged tongue of an infantry rifle, but a short, bright, suppressed spit of sound. It was the cough of a professional. Kolya's head snapped back as if struck by a giant, invisible hammer. A small, dark flower bloomed instantly in the center of his forehead. There was no cry, no dramatic stagger. His body simply folded, collapsing backward onto the mill's dirt floor with a soft, final thud. The boyish face that had grinned in the aircraft was now a slack, empty mask, his eyes fixed on the rotting rafters high above. The shock that held the group was a fraction of a second, a monument of ice erected in their veins. Then the mill erupted. Gromov's roar was raw, tearing from his throat. Sokolov was already moving, his PPSH spraying a furious, unaimed burst towards the source of the shot, chewing splinters from tree trunks. But there was no second shot, no enemy charge. The forest had returned to silence, deeper and more malevolent than before. The assassin was a ghost. Vera was scrambling, not for her weapon, but for her radio, her face a pale mask of horror and fury. This was not an ambush. It was a surgical removal, a silent, precise killing that spoke of intimate knowledge of their position and their sentry routine. It was a message. Gromov, his heart a battering ram against his ribs, crawled to Kolya's body. He knew before he touched him. The warmth was already leaching away, the shocking, profound stillness of death settling in. The young sapper who had worried about his straps, who had seen the refugee girl, who was the mission's future, was gone. Extinguished not in a heroic firefight, but erased by a single clinical shot from the shadows. Sokolov materialized beside him, his face a granite cliff of rage. He scanned the forest, his eyes missing nothing. He pointed with his chin, not at the forest, but at the ground just outside the entrance. A single, fresh footprint in the soft earth pointed away from the mill. The hunter had come, performed his work, and vanished, leaving only the chilling evidence of his calm, unhurried departure. The mill was no longer a refuge. It was a tomb they had willingly entered. Kolya's blood seeped into the dark earth, a stark, terrible ink. The mission's parameters had just been violently rewritten. The war outside was chaos, but this was a targeted, intelligent threat. Someone knew they were here. Someone was picking them off. And the haunting, repeating signal on Vera's radio now felt less like a ghost and more like a predator's lure, buzzing silently in the heart of their shattered sanctuary. The paranoia was no longer a creeping vine. It was a forest that had closed in around them, its darkest shadow having just spoken with the voice of a single, perfect bullet. The cold, antiseptic light of a 100-watt bulb glared down on a Formica table in a small utilitarian office within the Progress machine-building plant in Gorky. The air smelled of industrial grease, weak coffee, and stale fear. Major Igor Semyonov sat perfectly still. His dossier on Zenith 7 closed before him like a sealed verdict. Across from him, drowning in a suit that seemed to hang on his shrunken frame, was Alexei Viktorovich Karpov, hero of socialist labor, director of the Progress plant, and, in April 1945, Senior Lieutenant Alexei Karpov, communications officer of the 45th Guards Airborne Division, the division that prepared and launched Operation Zenith 7. Karpov's fingers, stained with a mechanic's permanent grime that no amount of washing could erase, trembled as they traced the edge of a cheap glass ashtray. His eyes, a faded blue, refused to meet Semyonov's. They darted to the portrait of Lenin on the wall, to the factory yard visible through the window, to anywhere but the silent, gray-eyed major and the unspoken past between them. Semyonov began not with an accusation, but with a fact, his voice a low, even pressure. On the morning of April 13th, 1945, you certified the final operational frequencies and encryption tables for Group Zenith 7. You handed the packet personally to Lieutenant Vera Sokolova before embarkation. Karpov gave a minute, jerky nod. A bead of sweat traced a path through the gray stubble on his temple. The mission failed, Semyonov continued, opening the file just enough to slide out a single photograph, the pre-jump group photo. He placed it before Karpov. They disappeared. We have spent 23 years looking for them. We have reviewed every record, interviewed every survivor, except you, Alexei Viktorovich. You returned from German captivity in 1949. Your debriefing was unusually brief, classified at the highest level. Karpov's breath hitched. He looked at the photo. His gaze lingered on Vera's serious face, then on young Kolya's, and a profound, soul-sick weariness seemed to collapse his shoulders further. It was chaos, the end of the war. Many were lost, he whispered, a rehearsed line from 1,000 sleepless nights. Semyonov leaned forward, a predator entering the prey's space. We have the German archival record now, Alexei Viktorovich, from the Abwehr field office in Wittenberge. A communique dated April 12, 1945. It details the anticipated insertion of a Soviet sabotage group in Sector G7, approximate strength and possible objectives. It is remarkably accurate. Too accurate to be guesswork. He let the sentence hang. The factory's distant hum filled the room, a monotonous drone. Karpov's face drained of all remaining color, becoming the shade of old parchment. The trembling spread from his hands to his entire body. He was not looking at a portrait of Lenin anymore. He was staring into the abyss of his own memory. Semyonov delivered the final, calculated blow. He did not shout. He almost sighed. The Germans knew Alexei Viktorovich. They were waiting, not with an army. They didn't have one to spare. But they knew. The question is, how? The dam broke not with a sob, but with a dry, rasping exhalation, as if Karpov's spirit was finally leaving him. His eyes glazed over, seeing not the office, but a cramped, damp interrogation cell, the glare of a single lamp, the smiling, reasonable face of a Hauptmann from the Abwehr, who spoke flawless Russian. They had everything. Karpov's voice was a ghost of a sound. The flight path, the call signs, the composition of the group. Not the target coordinates, but they knew a high-value group was coming. They showed me transcripts of our own communications planning. They said it was over, that they would make it quick for the group if I confirmed. He was not confessing to treason for ideology or fear of pain. He was confessing to a more banal, more human evil, the crushing, absolute despair of a prisoner who sees a way to make the inevitable slightly less terrible for others, a devil's bargain offered in a moment of absolute powerlessness. I gave them the authentication protocol for the radio, a daily changing code, a recognition signal, so they would know it was them on the air. I thought if the Germans could mimic center, they could order the group to stand down, to hide until it was over, to save them from a futile mission. A hollow, self-loathing chuckle escaped him. I was an engineer. I believed in elegant solutions, even in hell. Semyonov understood instantly. The horror was not in a grand betrayal, but in a technical one. Karpov had handed the Germans the keys to Zenith 7's only lifeline. He had made their radio, their sanctuary, into a potential weapon against them. The unconfirmed signal Vera heard at the mill, It could have been the Germans, testing their stolen voice, learning to speak in the comforting tones of home. What happened after? Semyonov pressed, his own blood cold. Did you give them the frequencies for the mission itself? Karpov shook his head, a desperate, weak motion. No, those were in the packet, with Sokolova. I didn't have them. But the authentication code, it was enough. With it, they could listen. They could know if the group tried to call home. They could find them. Semyonov sat back. The puzzle pieces clattered into a new, horrifying configuration. Zenith 7 hadn't just been lost. They had been illuminated. From the moment they landed, their own radio procedures were a beacon for a hunter who knew their secret handshake. The clinical shot that killed Kolya wasn't just marksmanship. It was the result of superior intelligence. The hunter had been listening. He had heard their silence, triangulated their fear, and moved in for a silent kill, confident he held the only key to their communications. Karpov was broken now, weeping silent, old man's tears onto the formica. They told me later, the Hauptmann, after the capitulation in the confusion. He was drunk. He said a Jagdkommando was formed, not regular army. SS and Abwehr leftovers, a cleanup unit. He said they were very pleased with their radio ghost. He laughed. Semyonov collected the photograph. The faces of Gromov, Vera, Kolya looked up at him, their fate now mapped in the trembling ruin of the man before him. They had been betrayed, not by a villain, but by a broken man's pathetic attempt at mercy, twisted by the enemy into a perfect trap. The mission was compromised before the plane's engines ever spooled up. They had jumped not into a military operation, but into a listening ear and a sniper's crosshairs. The investigation had found its source of the leak, but the truth offered no catharsis, only a deeper, more sickening dread for what must have come next. The hunter had their voice, and he was using it to call them into the dark. The forest after Kolya's death was no longer a landscape. It was a living, breathing enemy. Every rustle of leaves was the stealthy footfall of the hunter. Every snap of a twig was the cocking of his rifle. The mill, once a sanctuary, was now a sepulchre they fled, carrying the chilling certainty that they were not merely pursued, but known. Captain Gromov's orders were now stripped of all operational pretense, reduced to a single, primal imperative: move, survive, and find a way to turn the hunter into the hunted. Sergeant Sokolov moved with the lethal grace of a wounded bear, his eyes holding a new, glacial fire. The death of the boy sapper had transformed his professional soldier's duty into a personal vendetta. He scouted ahead, not just for danger, but for the perfect place for an ambush, his massive hands checking the edges of his knife with a chilling, ritualistic focus. The rest of the group, Vera, the medic Chistyakov, and scouts Voronin and Belyaev, moved in a tight, silent knot, their weapons sweeping the oppressive green gloom, their nerves stretched to a singing wire. They bypassed roads, skirted the faintest hint of human habitation, becoming ghosts themselves in a bid to shake the phantom on their trail. Vera's radio pack was no longer a lifeline. It was a cursed object, a potential transmitter of their doom. Yet it was also their only weapon against the invisible trap. During a tense halt in a rain-sodden thicket, she made a decision. Her face, pale and set, was illuminated by the faint, haunted glow of the dials as she powered the set on. This was not an attempt to contact center. That channel was death. Instead, her fingers flew over the controls with a desperate technical fury. She was hunting for the hunter's signal, the strange, repeating pulse she had intercepted at the mill. If the enemy was using the airwaves as a net, she would find the threads. Back in 1968, Major Semyonov's investigation mirrored her desperate search through the ether of the past. He was no longer in clean offices. He sat in the dusty basement of the Central Military Archive, surrounded by mountains of captured German tactical logs, the Kriegstagebücher. These were not the sanitized reports sent to Berlin, but the raw, handwritten, hour-by-hour accounts of frontline units. The air was thick with the dust of disintegration. He was looking for a specific ghost, the Jagdkommando. He found it not in a major order, but in a scribbled addendum to the log of a disbanding SS Panzergrenadier Battalion. Dated April 17, 1945. Remaining signals, intelligence assets, and volunteer personnel transferred per Standartinfanterie Grawitz's directive to Autonomous Unit Nachtfalke for rear area security operations. Objective: neutralization of confirmed Soviet intelligence elements in Sector G7. All frequencies and decryption protocols provided. Nachtfalke, Night Falcon. The name was a whisper of professional nocturnal predation. And then Semyonov found the chilling footnote. The unit was to utilize Beutefunkverfahren, captured radio procedures. Karpov's betrayal had a name and a designation. This was the creature hunting Zenith 7. In the dripping German forest, Vera's hunt bore fruit. Her headset hissed, and then she heard it again. Closer now. Stronger. The same automated, repeating pulse. But now, her trained ear detected a faint, almost imperceptible, secondary signal riding beneath it. A carrier wave, a listening post. The Nachtfalke was not just broadcasting a lure, it was keeping the channel open. A silent ear waiting for Zenith 7 to break radio silence and scream for help, to betray their position with their own stolen voice. She showed Gromov the frequency on her notepad. Her eyes were blazing with a cold, electric realization. The hunter was listening. So, they would make him hear. Gromov understood. It was a gamble with their lives as the only stake. He pointed to a location on his map, a steep, wooded ridge overlooking a narrow valley road. It was defensible, with clear lines of sight. They would use the terrain. They would use the radio. They reached the ridge as dusk began to stain the sky purple and gray. Exhaustion was a physical weight on them all, but it was burned away by adrenaline and rage. Sokolov and Voronin began preparing firing positions, their movements swift and silent. Belyaev mined the approach track with the last of their precious explosives. Chistyakov readied his kit, his face grim. Vera set up her radio at the center of their makeshift perimeter. This was the bait. Gromov gave the order. She took a deep breath, her fingers steady on the key. She did not send a distress call. She sent a deliberate, structured burst of coded gibberish, enough to sound like a legitimate, panicked attempt to establish contact, laced with the authentication protocol Karpov had betrayed. She was tapping the spider's web. Then they waited. The minutes crawled by, each second a lifetime. The forest sank into the deep, velvety blackness of a moonless night. The only sounds were the wind in the pines and the frantic beating of their own hearts. Then, a new sound. Not from the radio, from the valley below. The low, grinding purr of a vehicle engine, carefully muted, creeping along the road. Blackout lights were just pin-pricks in the gloom, a Kubelwagen, and a motorcycle with a sidecar. The Nachtfalke had taken the bait. Gromov watched through his field glasses. Figures disembarked from the vehicles, silhouettes moving with professional discipline. 6, maybe 7 men, They fanned out, beginning a silent ascent of the ridge, following the electronic breadcrumbs Vera had laid. They were not a rabble. They were a precision instrument. Sokolov, lying in a nest of roots, watched the lead hunter approach his kill zone. The man was clad in a mix of camouflage smock and black uniform, a STG-44 assault rifle held at the ready. He moved like smoke. This was the creature who had killed Kolya. The trap was sprung not with a shout, but with the soft click of Belyaev's detonator. The mine on the track erupted in a concussive flower of flame and earth, engulfing the motorcycle and throwing the Kubelwagen onto its side. The night tore apart. Sokolov's machine gun spoke first, a long, tearing burst that scythed through the undergrowth, catching two of the ascending figures, throwing them down like rag dolls. The ridge exploded in a deafening storm of muzzle flashes. Voronin and Belyaev fired controlled bursts from their cover. The Nachtfalke unit, caught in the open, reacted with frightening speed, returning fire, using the terrain, their green tracer rounds stitching the dark. But they were in the kill zone. Gromov fought with a cold, detached fury, picking his targets. This was not the chaos of a battlefield. It was a violent, intimate argument between professionals in the dark. He saw Sokolov rise from his position, not retreating, but advancing down the slope, firing from the hip, a roaring avatar of vengeance closing in on the stunned survivors. It was then, in the strobing light of gunfire, that Gromov saw him. A tall officer, standing calmly beside the wrecked Kubelwagen, not seeking cover. He was looking not at the battle, but up the ridge, directly towards the flickering glow of Vera's radio dials, visible in the dark. He held not a rifle, but a field telephone handset, connected to a pack on his back. A radio direction finder. He hadn't just been listening to the signal. He had been homing in on it. His face, illuminated for a split second, was calm, intellectual, a scientist observing a successful experiment gone violently wrong. Gromov swung his submachine gun, but the officer, as if sensing the gaze, melted back into the shadows behind the vehicle. The firefight was ending, the Jagd Commando unit shredded by the ambush. But their commander, the architect of the hunt, had vanished as suddenly as he appeared, leaving only his dead and the humming, poisonous knowledge that the true predator was still out there. He had come for the radio, for the voice, and he had seen its source. The victory on the ridge was ashen. They had killed the hounds, but the falcon was still circling somewhere in the night, and now it had seen their eyes. The victory on the ridge was a poison. It tasted of cordite, blood, and the sour realization that they had merely swatted at the claws of the beast, not slain it. The brief, vicious firefight had left the Nachtfalke commandos broken on the slope, but the calm officer with the direction finder had evaporated into the night, a phantom who now carried the certain knowledge of their position and their tactics. Captain Gromov knew they had minutes, perhaps an hour, before a more formidable response coalesced. The group moved with a new, grim synchronization, a machine honed by loss and paranoia. They abandoned the ridge, leaving the German dead, but taking their weapons, their ammunition, and a handful of documents snatched from a blood-stained map case. They found refuge in the one place the hunter might not immediately look: the ruins of a bombed-out village church. Its roof was open to the weeping sky, the stone walls scarred by shrapnel, the air inside heavy with the smell of damp plaster and charred wood. A shattered statue of Christ looked down with blind eyes. Here, in this hollowed-out sanctuary, the final fractures appeared. Sergeant Sokolov paced like a caged tiger, the stolen SG-44 feeling like a toy in his massive hands. His vengeance was incomplete, and the energy of it threatened to burn him from the inside out. He argued with Gromov, not with words, but with the violent intensity of his silence and the sharp, jerky gestures towards the east, towards the front lines that were now a myth. His meaning was clear. The original mission was a suicide note written by a command that had betrayed them with its incompetence. Their only objective now was survival, and survival meant moving east towards the advancing Red Army, not deeper into the labyrinth. Vera, however, was a statue of cold resolve. She sat amidst the rubble, the captured German documents spread before her, illuminated by a sliver of gray dawn light filtering through a broken stained glass window. The papers were not tactical orders. They were intelligence summaries, intercepts, and, most critically, a partial list of frequencies and the call sign Nachtfalke 1. She had seen the officer by the car, the direction finder. He was not just a hunter. He was the nerve center, the Nachtfalke's command and control, and she believed she could find him. Her argument was etched in the lines of her face. The hunter had their authentication codes. He could mimic center. As long as he was alive and operating, he was a clear and present danger, not just to them, but to any other Soviet unit behind the lines. He was a cancer. She tapped the radio set beside her. They had his frequencies now. They could turn his own weapon against him. They could draw him into a trap. It was no longer about Venk's phantom headquarters. It was about silencing the voice that was stealing theirs. Gromov stood between them, the map in his hands feeling like lead. He was the commander, but the ground beneath the concept of command had vanished. To the east lay the chaos of a collapsing front, the possibility of reaching their own lines, but also the certainty of facing SMERSH interrogators who would dissect their failure, their survival, and the compromised mission. To the west lay the hunter, a tangible enemy, a chance to reclaim agency in a final, decisive act, but at the risk of total annihilation. It was no longer a choice between mission and survival. It was a choice between two different kinds of death. The medic Chistyakov, binding a shallow graze on Belyaev's arm, spoke without looking up. His voice was quiet, hollowed out by fatigue. He spoke of the wounded, of their dwindling medical supplies, of the infection spreading in Voronin's leg from a wound days old. He spoke of the physical limits of flesh. His words were a verdict. They could not run much longer. They had to either hide and hope to outlast the war by becoming inert, or they had to strike one last time. The decision was made not by Gromov, but by the slow, accepting nod from the weary scout Voronin, and the grim determination in Belyaev's eyes. They were soldiers. Hiding to die slowly in a hole was not in their code. The hunter had killed their youngest. He had turned their lifeline into a snare. The mission had morphed. It was personal. In 1968, Major Semyonov faced his own triad of impossible choices, each laid out in 3 separate files on his desk in a Berlin safe house. Each file represented a possible end for Zenith 7, each backed by archival evidence, each a perfectly constructed, official-grade truth. File 1, The Heroic Sacrifice. This was the preferred narrative, the one his superiors subtly demanded. It contained a Soviet after-action report from May 1945, compiled from reconnaissance and partisan sources. It stated that a sabotage group had engaged and destroyed a key German communications hub vaguely referencing the Nachtfalke unit, on April 18th near the village of Birkenwald, perishing in the process. The report was clean, noble, and unspecific. It demanded no further questions. It was the grave with the polished marble headstone. File 2. The tragic capture. This file was thicker, colder. It contained German Gestapo prisoner execution logs from the Magdeburg district, dated April 20th, 1945. 7 entries, listed only as Fallschirmagenten, parachute agents. Time, place, method, shot while attempting escape. The dates fit. The numbers fit. The brutal, bureaucratic finality of it was horrifyingly plausible. This was the mass grave, unmarked, forgotten in the administrative fog of the Reich's death throes. File 3. The quiet liquidation. This file was the thinnest and the heaviest. It contained no German documents. It was composed of internal SMERSH memoranda from late April and early May 1945. They concerned operational security in the rear of advancing forces and the neutralization of potentially compromised assets. One cable, flagged by Semyonov, discussed a special group whose mission parameters were voided by rapid advance and whose secure extraction is not feasible. The recommended action was left blank, but the stamp of the approving officer was that of a notorious SMERSH general known for his ruthless pragmatism. This was not a grave in German soil. This was a file in a drawer, a bureaucratic euthanasia. This was the most terrible possibility of all, that after everything, the betrayal, the hunt, the survival, Zenith 7 had finally stumbled into the embrace of their own side, only to be erased as a loose end, their story terminated by the very state that sent them. Semyonov stared at the 3 files under the pallid light of his desk lamp. Each was a key that could lock the case of Zenith 7 forever. Each had its own evidence, its own terrible logic. His investigation had not found one truth. It had found 3 graves, and he had to choose which one to bury them in. The pressure was no longer about finding answers. It was about selecting the lie that would best serve the present, while the ghosts of the past, somewhere between the heroic sacrifice, the Gestapo cellar, and the silent field execution by their own, screamed in a silence he was now tasked to make eternal. The hunter, he realized, might have worn many uniforms, and the final shot might have come from any direction. The forest clearing was not on any map. It was a small, silent pocket of earth, where the trees seemed to stand back, forming a natural amphitheater. In its center stood a lone, lightning-blasted oak, its splintered trunk a stark, black finger against the bruised, purple twilight of April 18, 1945. This was the place Vera had calculated, the last known triangulated position of the Nachtfalke 1 signal, the place where the hunter's electronic heart was supposed to beat. It was a perfect killing ground, and Captain Gromov knew it the moment they slipped into its perimeter. The silence was too deep, the air too still. They were the bait and the trap, both, and the awful suspicion that they were dancing on the end of a string, held by a master puppeteer coiled in his gut. Sergeant Sokolov and Scout Belyaev took flanking positions among the dense firs, their forms dissolving into the shadows. The medic Chistyakov stayed with the limping Voronin in a shallow depression behind a fallen log, a final reserve. Vera and Gromov took cover at the base of the blasted oak, the radio set between them, its speaker silent, a deaf ear waiting for a ghost to speak. Vera's fingers were white on the headset cord. Her plan was simple to the point of madness. Transmit a burst of coded data on the hunter's own frequency, a distress signal laced with the stolen authentication, a digital scream meant to sound like a wounded animal caught in its own trap. Then wait for the predator to come and finish the job. Except the job would be finished on their terms, in their kill zone. She looked at Gromov, her eyes asking the final unspoken question. He gave a single, sharp nod. There were no alternatives left. This was the last move in a game played on a board of shadows. She pressed the transmit key. The signal hissed into the ether, a brief, malignant burst of encrypted noise. Then they waited. The silence that followed was a physical presence, thick and suffocating. Seconds stretched into a minute. 2. The forest held its breath. Gromov's eyes scanned the opposite tree line, his finger resting on the cold curve of his weapon's trigger. Sokolov, somewhere to his left, was a statue of concentrated violence. The crackle from the radio speaker made them both flinch. It was not the expected structured signal. It was raw, open-channel voice transmission. A man's voice, calm, educated, speaking in fluent, unaccented Russian. "Captain Gromov, Lieutenant Sokolova, we have your bearing. You have fought with remarkable tenacity. A credit to your training." The voice was everywhere and nowhere, emanating from the radio, but also, it seemed, from the very trees. It was the voice of the officer with the direction finder. Nachtwalke. He was not walking into their trap. He was announcing he had already sprung his own. "Your mission is obsolete," the voice continued, its tone almost conversational. "Wenk's headquarters relocated 48 hours before your jump. You were sent to destroy a phantom. A fact your command likely suspected but chose to ignore. Expendable assets in an expending war." Each word was a precise, surgical cut, severing the last ties to their purpose, their worth, their very identity. "You have two choices. You can die here, in this clearing, for a lie. Or you can surrender your radio and your codes to me. With them I can create confusion, delay the inevitable for a few more days. Save some of my people. A tactical trade. Your war is over. Mine has a few acts left." The offer hung in the static-filled air. It was not a trick. It was the cold calculus of another professional at the end of his world. He didn't want to kill them. He wanted their voice. One last tool. Before Gromov could process the monstrous proposal, the forest exploded. But not from the direction they expected. A storm of automatic fire erupted from behind their positions, from the very path they had used to enter the clearing. Heavy, sustained fire from Degtyaryov machine guns, a Soviet weapon. Green tracer rounds ripped through the trees above their heads, a warning hail. Shouts in Russian, not German, filled the air. "Surround them. Do not let them escape." Gromov's world upended. The hunter had not come. Their own side had. Through the chaos of shouts and the suppressing fire, he saw figures in Soviet infantry uniforms, but without clear unit insignia, moving with aggressive, practiced, flanking maneuvers. They were not here to rescue. They were here to contain. Sokolov, from his position, opened fire, not at the new arrivals, but into the tree line across the clearing, where he had seen a flicker of movement. The German hunter was still there, watching, as the two forces he had manipulated closed in on each other. What followed was not a battle. It was a chaotic, three-way massacre in the twilight. The unidentified Soviet unit poured fire into the clearing. Sokolov and Belyaev returned fire, targeting the muzzle flashes, buying time. Chistyakov was hit, a red bloom flowering on his chest as he tried to drag Voronin back. The German, seizing the opportunity, fired a long, precise burst from his concealed position, cutting down, two of the advancing Soviet soldiers. Gromov grabbed Vera, pulling her down as rounds chewed the bark from their oak. Her face was a mask of shattered understanding. The hunter had broadcast their location, not to his own men, but to the Soviet Smersh cleanup unit, hunting for compromised assets. He had pitted the two forces against each other, a final, elegant solution. In the hellish crossfire, Gromov made a decision. He pointed to the radio, then to the thickest part of the forest, away from both forces. His order was clear. Run. Now. Vera shook her head, clutching the radio. This was her weapon, her reason. He ripped it from her hands. His eyes held a final command, an absolution, and a farewell. He shoved her violently towards the deepening gloom of the forest. He then did the unimaginable. He stood up, into the clearing, firing his PPSH not at the Germans, not at the Soviets, but into the air. A roaring, defiant silhouette drawing every eye, every barrel towards himself. "Forward! For the motherland!" he screamed, a rallying cry for a unit that was no longer there, a performance for an audience of wolves. The fire converged on him. Sergeant Sokolov, seeing his commander fall, let out a roar that drowned the gunfire and charged from his cover, not towards safety, but towards the last position of the German hunter, a final furious act of vengeance that ended in a storm of bullets. Silence, sudden and absolute, fell over the clearing like a shroud. In the archive in 1968, Major Igor Semyonov closed the third file, the one labeled The Quiet Liquidation. He did not choose it. The evidence chose him. He had found in a forgotten personal effects locker a single, water-stained notebook. It belonged to a Smersh captain who led a rear security detachment in April 1945. The final entry, dated April 19th, read, "Operation Cleansing in Sector G7 concluded. German intelligence unit Nachtfalke eliminated. Remaining compromised elements of our own Zenith group neutralized. Radio equipment destroyed. No survivors. No prisoners. Situation resolved." The truth was not one of the three graves. It was a grotesque fusion of all of them. They had died in a heroic last stand against a German hunter. They had been executed in the chaos. And they had been liquidated by their own side. All three versions were true, layered over each other like geological strata of betrayal. Semyonov took a clean form. He wrote the final report. He cited the after-action report of the heroic sacrifice. He ignored the Gestapo logs. He buried the Smersh notebook deep within the file, behind a divider marked Ancillary Materials, Unverified. His report stated, Group Zenith 7, having successfully diverted and engaged superior enemy forces, was killed in action on April 18, 1945. While preventing the enemy's use of captured communications intelligence, their actions delayed enemy operations and contributed to the final offensive. Recommend posthumous decoration. He signed it. He stamped it. He closed the heavy folder marked Permanent Storage. He walked out of the archive into the dull Moscow daylight. The ghosts were filed. The story was set in the concrete of official history, but as he lit a cigarette, his hand was perfectly steady. He saw not the report, but the clearing. He saw Gromov standing, drawing the fire. He saw Vera's face as she was shoved into the forest, clutching not a radio, but her life, the last fragment of Zenith 7 to escape the closing trap. And in his mind the voice of the German hunter, Nachtfalke, whispered from the static of history, a ghost not in the file, but in the space between the lines. You have two choices. You can die for a lie, or you can be the one who tells it. Major Semyonov had made his choice. The case was closed. The silence he left behind was not the silence of truth, but the deeper, more permanent silence of a grave that had just been expertly, finally filled.